Due Process, for the second consecutive year, recipient of Mid-Atlantic Emmy Awards for Outstanding Talk Show Series and Outstanding Public Affairs Series.
It's not a perfect world out there, and if I'm getting discriminated against like this now, what are the children going to face in the future?
Can a person be fired for being obese? Does the law protect overweight employees? I'm Raymond Brown. The legal consequences of obese discrimination, up next on Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process is made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding is provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual, publishers of print and electronic information for and about the legal community, including the legislative manual.
Obesity. Most of us think of it as a health issue, but in fact, being heavy can have important legal consequences. I'm Raymond Brown, and we're going to explore the question of whether being substantially overweight can be considered a disability. Can you be fired just because you're obese? Or are folks who wrestle with their size entitled to some protection on their jobs? At least one New Jersey woman took her struggle over that very issue to court, as we see in this special Due Process report.
I was in such shock, and then I got all upset, and I couldn't believe it. I was like, you know, this is the 90s. This doesn't go on anymore, so I thought, you know.
What went on, this woman says, was job discrimination, not on the basis of race or gender or age, but for her weight. She says she was fired just for being fat.
Discrimination or violence because of race or religion, ancestry or gender, disability or sexual orientation is wrong, and it ought to be illegal.
Is discrimination based on size illegal? Does the law view obesity as a bona fide disability?
The New Jersey law against discrimination is a very progressive anti-discrimination law. It does protect obesity. Obesity may be considered a disability, and that's clear from case law.
And Bruce Bernstein is hoping that case law will make his client a winner in her size discrimination suit against farmland dairies.
I have definitely been crushed. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it.
Anne-Marie Lamantia is convinced she was fired because she is obese, and so is her former supervisor, who was also terminated.
Well, I was walking through the parking lot to the front building where the main offices were, and Jake Goldman stopped me and asked me who that fat girl was that was walking through the parking lot. And I said, who are you talking about? And he said, that new girl, you hired her, didn't you? And I said, yeah, she's one of my best workers. Why? He goes, well, she's fat. She's going to fall and sue us. You'll have to get rid of her. And I said, but Jake, she's one of my best workers, and I don't want to do that.
And she says when she refused, her manager did what she would not do.
He goes, come on in. He called me in his office, closed the door. He said, well, you're still on your probation. He goes, as of today, you're terminated. I asked why, and he said, I'm not impressed with your job performance. In just that tone, he said it. I said, okay. So I cleaned out my desk, punched out, and I went home.
I called Emery at home to see, you know, did it really happen? And it did. She said, yeah, they let me go, and, you know, did I do something wrong? Was it, you know, I tried so hard, and she was in tears, and I knew she did try her hardest. She made every effort to be there, you know, she was there all the time. She made every effort to learn every aspect of both areas of the department, which the other girls didn't want to do. She was willing to, and did it. Took it upon herself to learn it. She was working 60 hours a week. I mean, she really put a great effort into her job and did a good job. So at that point, I said to her, I need to come over and talk to you.
And she came over. The poor girl couldn't even look at me. She was so distraught and so upset. She had her face like down, and she couldn't look at me. She was full of tears. She was all welled up. And I was just in shock when she told me that they fired me because they said they didn't like how big I was, my size.
The hardest thing for me to do was to tell her the words that he told me because she was fat. It was humiliating. It was embarrassing. It was so difficult, you know, but I felt that she needed to know that she was a good worker and there really wasn't anything wrong.
Farmland Dairy says it fired LaMantia for poor job performance. Jake Goldman's son, Mark, who runs the dairy, agreed to talk on camera, but insisted we shoot him on his terms, with 4 employees behind him, all of them, no coincidence, overweight.
As you know, with regards to the case that brings you here, it would be inappropriate to comment on it, given that it's now in litigation. And so, with regards to it, I won't make any comment except to say that at Farmland Dairies, we do not practice discrimination in any way. And I think that, obviously, from the people standing around me right now who are long-term employees who have a combined 30 or 40 years of employment history here at Farmland, it speaks for itself that we don't practice discrimination.
In August 1991, the state appellate division found that obesity can be a handicap, and that in the case before it, an employer had discriminated against a handicapped employee.
I gave my job 110%. I always gave it that extra effort. You know, I was always like somebody's right hand if they needed it, you know.
And that's what LaMantia claims in the lawsuit now pending.
A company can judge people based upon their appearance if it's relevant to what they do. If you're Victoria's Secret and you're trying to sell swimsuits, you can choose your models because that's a legitimate part of your business. You can choose people who will portray the image you're trying to project. But in Ms. LaMantia's case, she was a computer worker, and her size and her appearance did not affect what she did at all. In fact, she was very good at it.
And that's been Pat Summers' position all along, a position that she claims got her fired in retaliation for her refusal to fire the overweight worker. So Summer is LaMantia's co-plaintiff.
She opposed a practice that she felt was discriminatory, and they didn't want to hear that.
I was there another week. You know, I wasn't terminated until the following Monday. I came in that Monday morning and my manager said, come in here, I need to talk to you. He says, you're no longer working here. I'm letting you go. And I said, and your reason is? And he said, you just don't help me. I said, that's your reason? I just don't help you? And he said, yes.
The point is that if someone like Ms. Summers has the courage to stand up and prevent discrimination from occurring, the courts are going to protect those people too. They have to make these discrimination laws work. So even though Ms. Summers wasn't discriminated against, she was standing up for somebody who was, and therefore it's linked back to the whole discrimination problem.
It's not really the fault necessarily of the individual who happens to be overweight. So to put the burden of blame or to put the blame on the individual is really unfair, and in that sense it discriminates against the individual. And if the person can function in his or her job without any difficulty, then the obesity that the person has is really more of a cosmetic problem than a problem related to their work function or work activity.
The very essence of discrimination is formulating an opinion about somebody, not because of the merits of their work, but because of the way they look.
It's not a perfect world. They're not all Barbie dolls out there. I mean, you know, most people are a little bit overweight. You know, some more than others, some less than others.
It's an unfortunate truth that most of us battle with weight at some point in our lives, and indeed, for some, it's a lifelong campaign. At what point will the law step in and say that firings are discriminatory when the employee involved is obese? And on the other hand, are there some folks who use their heaviness as an excuse not to give their employer a fair day's labor for a fair day's pay? We've brought together some people who've given this subject deep thought. You'll meet them and hear their views right after this.
I don't think there's discrimination against overweight people in the workplace, mainly because if you look at pretty much any workplace, you know, not all of us are slim and trim.
Nothing is perfect in the world. If that's all they're looking for, then they're discriminating just like they would be against race or religion.
I think that people who are overweight are the same as people who are underweight, and that there should be no discrimination against anybody.
I've never had a problem, and I'm not too slim.
Some people say we do have a problem because there are workers who've been illegally fired for being obese. It shouldn't surprise you, however, to know that there are others with a decidedly contrary view. We've brought them together to discuss the subject. Joining us from Newark is Maxine Newhouser, a lawyer who represents employers and has written and lectured widely on employment law. And here in Trenton, Christopher Kelly, an employment lawyer who frequently handles cases involving wrongful discharge claims. And Robert Sponagle, chairperson of the South Jersey chapter of NAFA, the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance. Welcome to you all. Robert, let me start with you. I have to admit, I never heard of NAFA until not long ago when a New York sports club or health club had a sign that said, when aliens come, they'll eat the fat ones first. And the national spokesperson for your organization began to talk about how insensitive and unfair the world could be to those who are heavy. I'm a little surprised that you used the word fat in your title. Why?
Well, fat is just an adjective. There's really no other word that anybody can use to use as well. I mean, you don't want to use the term overweight because overweight assumes everybody should be a certain weight. You wouldn't use the term overheight for a tall person. So fat is just an adjective. It's just a simple description. It only is a bad word when it's put with another word like fat pig or whatever.
Why does your organization exist? What's its purpose?
Well, it's many. We have many folds, many reasons to exist. One of the things, of course, is discrimination, which we're going to discuss. And that's very important to try to change laws, to try to make sure that no one's discriminated against. And the group also does social things, and it's also a support group, too, for people who just want to come and talk.
Okay. Maxine Newhouser, let me draw you into the conversation from Newark and talk a little about the legal issues. You are, in fact, one of the lawyers involved with one of the most important cases in this state on the question. You represent employers, but are you satisfied that at least on the face of it in New Jersey, you cannot fire an employee solely because they're obese or overweight?
Well, I think that the case law is not quite as clear as that. My law firm and I handled the appeal in the Gemello versus Agency Rent-A-Car case. And the court was not really comfortable in saying that obesity is a handicap in all situations and that obesity discrimination per se is illegal.
Let me ask you this. If I was an employer and came to you seeking advice so I would not have problems down the road, what would you tell me would be a good rule for me to apply in terms of evaluating and terminating and even hiring employees?
I would tell you to evaluate employees, hire employees, discipline employees upon their job performance.
Are there any circumstances under which I could say, I don't want to hire you or keep you because you're fat, you're obese, you're overweight?
Well, sure. I think that the beginning segment showed that there are times when weight is an essential function of the job, for example, modeling for Victoria's Secret. I'm sure that there are other jobs where weight is a legitimate performance or essential job function issue. Comes to mind perhaps firefighters, policemen, those sorts of jobs. That's one of the reasons why employers today are often advised that they should do job descriptions to determine what the essential functions of the job are, so that requirements such as height and weight requirements in a physical sort of job can be determined.
Chris Kelly, you're on the other side. In fact, you're currently involved with a case that involves issues of weight discrimination. But let me ask you, in a general sense, I think probably most lawyers would agree with Ms. Newhouser that the case that established the principle in New Jersey was not a model of clarity. But do you think it's fair to say as a general rule that you can't be fired because you're overweight?
Well, I think the issue is unclear. People who are necessarily overweight are not necessarily protected by the law against discrimination. What the case said was that a person who is recognized as obese may in some circumstances be recognized or be protected by the law against discrimination.
Now, probably most people think they know what's meant by the word obese, but it sounds as though you have a specific meaning in mind, or the law has a specific meaning in mind.
Well, I think what's important to note is that if a person is intending to bring a lawsuit based upon obesity discrimination, that they necessarily should obtain a doctor's diagnosis that they are medically diagnosed as obese, as opposed to a person who is simply going in and claiming that they're overweight and that they were terminated because they were overweight.
Well, there's been some discussion around New Jersey of a case in which it was alleged that a woman was fired because her employer said he was concerned that her weight would cause her to fall in the parking lot. Not directly related to her job performance, but arguably having some connection. Is that the kind of case that would be controversial? Would you take a case like that?
Well, certainly I would take a case like that if certainly if the qualification was not related to the job. Then clearly it's a pretext for what the intended result of the employer was looking to do in that case. What the employer was looking to do in that case, it seems to me, was get rid of the person because of their weight and was using that as an excuse.
Ms. Newhouser, is that a common issue that you face representing employers, that there are plaintiffs who are saying, look, he said he fired me for X reason, but he really was intending to fire me because of my weight?
I can't say that I've seen any weight discrimination cases personally in my law firm since the Gemello case. It's not actually a common issue, although obviously it's one that's novel and getting publicity now. I find this particular case to be interesting because the allegation is that a woman was feared for being litigious and therefore fired, which in this day and age is sure to get you a lawsuit. I don't want to speak to the merits of this particular case, but weight is not really what we're seeing so much of these days.
Bob, let me bring you into the conversation. It seems interesting that we have two lawyers, one of whom was involved in the leading case, the other, Chris Kelly, who's interested in the area and involved in employment discrimination and has one. But the flavor I'm getting is that although we know there are many folks who are certainly not satisfied with their own weight, there are not a lot of cases where discrimination on the basis of weight is being alleged. Are the members of your organization saying generally we're being treated fairly?
No, not at all. I mean, even my own wife went to apply for a job a long time ago to a nonprofit group, and they told her in a roundabout way that if somebody saw her who was going to contribute and saw that she was fat, they wouldn't like that, and they probably wouldn't contribute. So it happens a lot. And there's also some things that aren't covered under the obesity law that's still discrimination. I mean, for example, some airlines are firing their flight attendants when they're 150 pounds. Well, that's not obese, but it's only because they want, trim flight attendants, which has nothing to do with 150 pounds being able to do their job.
Chris, why am I sensing a sort of a disconnect between what folks who are battling with weight feel, which is that they're being treated unfairly, and you and Maxine, both of whom are involved in the area, available for being retained, but not seeing large numbers of cases?
I think there's probably a couple reasons. I think that, number one, a lot of people are not aware that the law does protect obesity as a suspect category, such as race, sex, age, and so on. So people are not necessarily aware of their rights. And the other thing I think is that discrimination in all forms, at least nowadays, is very subtle. People are not necessarily even aware that they're being discriminated against because of their weight, even though in many cases they are. So I think probably for those two reasons. But for shows like this, which are getting out to the public and making them more aware of their rights, I think we're going to be seeing a lot more cases in the future.
Maxine, we seem to be wrestling with the meaning of a term here, and that is to the extent that the law may offer some protection to folks based on weight. What is obesity in the legal arena? Is that clear in New Jersey, or is that something that is still to be decided by the courts?
Well, it's not perfectly clear. And to follow up on your previous question as to why aren't we seeing a lot of obesity discrimination cases, I think it's because that the law does not say you can't be discriminated against because of obesity, but rather that the obesity cases are being filed under the rubric of handicap discrimination. And to say that someone who's overweight is handicapped or disabled in most cases is quite a stretch.
So you're saying that really the question is whether people who are overweight and terminated for that reason should be able to be protected by the statutes that currently exist in New Jersey?
That's correct. I mean, some of the case law, for example, points to what is morbidly obese. That seems to be actually the term that tends to get people covered under the handicap discrimination laws.
What does that mean, to be morbidly obese?
Well,
I mean, in general terms, I know there's a formula applied, but generally it's pretty extreme forms of overweight, or does it have to have other medical indicia?
Well, understanding that I have a JD and not an MD after my name, the reading that I've done and the case law that I've read suggests that it's 100 pounds over what the charts would say a person at that height ought to weigh. That's a lot of extra weight.
Chris, let me come back to this. I mean, Bob is saying that this is an ongoing problem of concern to large numbers of folks in his organization and elsewhere. But there seems to be a consensus between you and Maxine that the law is unclear as to what constitutes being overweight for purposes of legal protection, whether it's a handicap, and when the statutes apply. Do we have a gap here between a problem and an adequate remedy at law?
Well, I think the reason that it's unclear is because the one reported case in this state didn't really get into the facts of why it is that obesity is going to be recognized under the law as a handicap. What they did do is they compared obesity to alcoholism. And much the same way as alcoholism is a medically recognized disease, they've recognized that obesity should be and can be treated the same way. And what they've said is that obesity isn't necessarily going to prevent a person from doing something, but it may be perceived that way. And a perception of a handicap is protected under the law in the same way as an actual handicap is.
There's an interesting evolution here. I recall that in the battle over alcoholism, a battle that's still going on, there was a point at which large numbers of people said alcoholics are bad people. There's something wrong with them. They're weak. Now there's an increasing recognition that alcoholism is a disease. Whether it is physiological or psychological, there may be debates, but it's diseased conduct, and we're more and more willing to treat people as opposed to attack them.
That's right.
Is there a similar process here, Bob, with respect to the issue of weight? That is, we now have a tendency perhaps to say if you're fat, it's because you're undisciplined, and that's the end of it, as opposed to looking at it as a more complex phenomenon?
Well, I think the whole key is that diets don't work. I mean, everybody knows, including the doctors, that 95% of all diets fail, that most people regain more weight than what they started with, and most people end up larger when they diet, not smaller. So therefore, I don't think it's a disease. It's not something that can be treated. Just some people are meant to be bigger, and they may have gotten even bigger than that from dieting. So no, I don't think it would be a disease.
But the big battle in alcoholism and still in drug addiction is in getting the majority of the population to accept that at least there's a significant factor of disease, of non-willfulness, that a person can't control it without help.
Definitely beyond...
Is that, but I want to say, in terms of your interacting with the public, people who are have not studied it or haven't focused on it, is there a general acceptance that there are at least some pathological elements to being overweight, that it's not something you're doing because you're lazy or you don't care?
I think we're getting there. A lot of the public still thinks it's because fat people overeat or they're lazy or something, but I think more and more people are understanding that it's just genetics. There's a number of factors. You can't pin it down to one factor.
Now, Maxine, you said you had a JD and not an MD. Let me see whether you have any credentials that would qualify you to look into the crystal ball and tell us whether 10 years down the road, this is an issue that is going to be at least clear, and whether the courts combined with the legislature will make it clear that there's a clear definition of obesity, that it is a handicap, and that it is something that you can sue on, or whether things will remain murky or move in the other direction. What's your best sense?
Well, I think that it's likely that morbidly obese people, people who are grossly overweight, will be found medically to have some dysfunction of their metabolic system, a neurological system. Certainly, we've seen cases where experts have testified where a morbidly obese person has some dysfunction of a neurological appetite-suppressing function. And the courts have accepted that and have said, yes, in that case, it is a handicap. And while there is increasing research in that area, I think that people who fall into the grossly overweight category will find themselves able to fit in more comfortably to the definitions of handicap and disability, particularly in states like New Jersey, which have very broad definitions of disability and handicap in order to give broad protection to employees.
Okay, let me see what Chris and Bob think about the future. Bob, it sounds like Maxine is saying that only a narrow sliver of the people we would think of as overweight are going to get protection. Do you think that's the direction we're
I wouldn't necessarily agree with Maxine on that point. I think that in New Jersey, as well as other states, and under the federal law, I think the definition of handicap is expanding. We're seeing cases where people with back problems, people with heart conditions, people that you wouldn't necessarily consider handicapped in the traditional sense are being recognized under the law as handicapped.
Bob, quick, we're almost out of time. Is the picture rosy? Do you think we're going to get more protection for folks overweight, or is it going to be very narrow, as Maxine suggests?
I would very much like to see laws passed that put in weight as a protected class, not try to use the handicap. I mean, the handicap's fine for now, but Michigan has a law, San Francisco's considering it.
Your approach is almost revolutionary and an interesting concept, which means we'll have to come back and review this subject again. But for the moment, that's it for Due Process. I've got to thank my guests and urge you to join us next week when our docket will include yet another important look at law and social justice. Till then, for all of us here at Due Process, I'm Raymond Brown.
It doesn't really matter how overweight you are. People ask me sometimes, well, how overweight do you have to be protected? The point is, you're protected as soon as your employer thinks you're too heavy to do the job. You could be 200 pounds, you could be 500 pounds. But if your employer thinks that your weight's affecting your ability to do the job, and it's not, you're being discriminated against. So people should know that they have rights, and that if they find out that their employers are making bad decisions about them based upon their appearance and their weight, that they should do something about it. They are protected. Even if you're really not disabled, you don't have to be disabled. But many times it's a perception. Employers think, oh, that person's disabled. Or they might think that person's overweight, or that person has AIDS, or that person has epilepsy, and they might just want to get rid of them. But the point is, if those disabilities don't legitimately affect their ability to do the job, then they're being discriminated against, even if they don't have those impairments.
Major funding for Due Process was made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding was provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual, publishers of print and electronic information for and about the legal community, including the legislative manual.